I'm Sudhir Pandey. Welcome to Ahmedabad University. We are a non-profit research university, and we believe that the classroom should be able to do few things. And most of the things people should be able to do, particularly students outside the classroom. And in that effort, we run several seminars and other intellectual discussions, and we invite deep scholars or engaged scholars who have done great work in their area. In this tradition, we have this conversation series where we have been inviting people from all walks of life. And today it is entirely different. So we are thrilled to have Aanchal Malhotra to Ahmedabad University. I'll just briefly introduce. Aanchal Malhotra is an oral historian and writer from New Delhi, India. She is the co-founder of the Museum of Material Memory, and I request everybody to visit this museum, a crowdsourced digital repository tracing family histories and social ethnography through heirlooms, collectibles, and antiques from the Indian subcontinent. And it is a treat to visit this museum, which is digital. Aanchal writes extensively on the 1947 partition and its related topics. Her first book, published in South Asia as Remnants of Separation in 2017 and internationally as Remnants of Partition 2019, won the Council for Museum Anthropology Book Award 2020 just now in the last week. So congratulations, Aanchal, for this. And it was also shortlisted for the Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar, British Academy Book Prize, Hindu Lit for the for Life Non-Fiction Prize, and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay NIF Book Prize, and this Shakti Bhatt Book Prize. So you can understand how this book is popular, and it is receiving all critical acclaims, and people love it. Her second book, In the Language of Remembering, tracing the long-term cross-border generational legacy of partition, was published to critical acclaim in early 2022. And her forthcoming work, which is her first novel, titled The Book of Everlasting Things, will come somewhere around December, I hope. So thank you so much, Aanchal, for joining us today, and welcome to Ahmedabad University. The person who will be in conversation with Aanchal is Professor Ravi Miglani. Professor Ravi Miglani graduated from IIM Ahmedabad in 1983. After that, he went on to work in the market research industry for a very long time. And then he again came back to the industry, and now he is the director for the executive education at Ahmedabad University. And we all know he loves to read. He's also behind this conversation series running for the past 3 years. He loves to read, loves to connect with people. He also loves to cook and create food stories around it. And he also has a deep history with this theme, which is the partition. And he has heard these stories in his family as a part of his family stories right from the childhood. So he'll be in conversation with Aanchal. That will be really interesting to see. Before I hand it over to Professor Miglani, there are certain rules, except these two people who will be in conversation today. We all will be muted. And while they are in conversation for the next 60 minutes, I would request everybody to put your questions in everyone's chat box so that we can curate and come back to you at the end of the conversation so that the our guest can address those questions. So thank you so much for joining, and I request Professor Miglani to take it forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Sudhir, and welcome everyone to Ahmedabad University, and especially welcome Aanchal for finding time to do this in the middle of writing several books and doing several other things. It is fitting that we are doing this conversation in the 75th year of India's independence. But as we notice, there's a lot of talk about independence, and there's a lot of drama around Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav and so on. But there's not enough talk about partition, which happened at the same time as independence. So somehow we seem to have kind of forgotten partition, and we only remember the good side of independence, which is what is a human tendency always. So, so before we get into the history of partition and the oral history and human history of partition, if you could, in a few minutes, give our audience kind of a potted history of what was partition, because a lot of our audience are young students, and they might not have much of an idea of what happened in 1947.
Thank you so much for having me and taking out time for this kind of work. I really appreciate it. The history of partition as I understood it in school, because you said there are a lot of young people listening, was really a history of maps and statistics. And I never really understood the human angle to it. I knew that in British India was divided into India and Pakistan, and no other details were really divulged, no intricacies of what happened. So it is mostly through personal research, interest, and an acceptance of not knowing enough that I have been able to understand, look at archives, and I suppose write a new kind of history, which encompassed human voices. So the history of partition very simply is the division of British India into the independent nations of India and Pakistan, India as a secular state and Pakistan as an Islamic republic. It happened, South Asians learned that partition would happen on June 3rd, 1947, but I think in the minds of many, what this partition meant was quite vague. Conversations around partition, the Muslim League proponing for the creation of Pakistan had continued since as early as the 1930s. And what many people don't realize is the word Pakistan itself is an acronym. Of course, it is Pakistan, the land of the pure, but it also stands for Punjab, Afghania, Kashmir, Sindh, and Balochistan, which were the ideal territories envisioned by the League that would encompass this new country. As we know, that didn't entirely happen. So common South Asians learned about partition on June 3rd, 1947, through a radio broadcast in which the last Viceroy, Lord Louis Mountbatten, announced that this partition would take place. But even then, no one really understood who would draw this line and where the boundary of India would end and the landmass of Pakistan would begin. And so would the map maker be an Indian? Would they be a Britisher? Would they be Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, Parsi? No one really knew. And there were a lot of rumors, as you can imagine. And rumors obviously led to preemptive migrations in certain cases as well. But eventually people learned that a map maker from England was coming, Sir Cyril Radcliffe, and he arrived on July 8th and was given approximately 5 weeks to partition the land. And what he was partitioning were primarily the provinces of Punjab in the west and Bengal in the east that had the most intermingling of religious populations, where people really lived in very, very close proximity to one another, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Parsis. And his job was to create a line that would fairly divide the two provinces between the two new nations. And I don't have to stress on how ridiculous 5 weeks sounds for such a process, because even his own secretaries, his own private secretary, who was really the one who kept copious letters and notes about Sir Cyril Radcliffe's time in India, his name was Christopher Beaumont. And he wrote a lot of letters, particularly to his mother. So he is the one who writes that there is someone who has been appointed and I am his secretary. He is the one who writes, Sir Cyril Radcliffe arrived on July 8th in India, and this is what he's going to be doing. He's also the one who writes that partitioning the land will be very difficult and we will leave everyone with grievances all around. So this is quite a candid disclosure, which I don't think he thought anyone would read, which is why his estate was only made public after his death. The documents can be found in All Souls in England. So Cyril Radcliffe arrives and he, for the most part, is given help through 2 boundary commissions, one for Bengal, one for Punjab, each that consists of 5 judges, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, diversity. And they are to help his decision in seeing where the line will fall. But given the nature, the very emotional nature of this division, the judges are not entirely helpful because they start vying for one city or another. Give us Lahore, give us Calcutta, cut through here. What about the waterworks? And I think at the end, And I say I think because Sir Radcliffe left no papers, so it's difficult to assume what he thought. But I suppose at the end, he was left mostly to his own devices with the help of his assistants drawing the line. It's complicated because there are aspects of this border that no one expected. For instance, I have heard time and time again how Hindus and Sikhs who were an economic majority in Lahore assumed, or not even assumed, were almost certain of the fact that Lahore would go to India. I have also heard of places, if you think about it, Sikh shrines remain in Pakistan, a big imam's grave remains in India. So it's a bit of an arbitrary decision at times where 51% of Muslim populations fall in India, or things like this. So, for instance, as we were talking the other day, and as I've written in my book, there were areas, and I know you have it a little bit in your notes as well. There were areas where people were so certain that they would be a part of one country that they raised the flag of that country. In places like Dalhousie, which was a part of Gurdaspur district, or Malda, where the Muslim community was a majority, they raised the flag of Pakistan. And then 3 days later, or a few days later in certain cases, the Indian flag was raised. Another thing that added to the confusion in people's minds was the fact that independence took place on August 14 and 15, respectively, for Pakistan and India, and the border was only announced on August 17. And for many people, this meant that while they were rejoicing independence, the pain of partition came belatedly, and they really had to scramble and struggle if they found themselves on the wrong side of the border, as many people did. The riots of partition, I don't think, are something that really need to be explained because it is there in everyone's mind and popular imagination, but we can talk about that later as well. But in the end, as August drew to a close, you had India sandwiched in the middle of West Pakistan and East Pakistan, and leading to the largest mass migration of people outside of wartime in the world. Official figures say something like 12 to 14 million, but we can only assume it to be much larger. And the death toll was recorded as something like 1 million, but again, we can assume it to be much larger. And 75 years have passed, and I think only towards the last maybe decade has this kind of human history started to be exhumed, the kind of history that I write, which involves people and not only politicians or the corridors of politics.
So coming to the kind of the core of our conversation today, because many of our audience are from our university and many are from many other academic institutions, and we are research university, as Sudhir said in his introduction, and researchers don't like fuzzy data. Researchers like black and white data, and there is a view, and hopefully you will help us change our mind on that. But there is a view that history has to be documented history based on real facts, real archives, real documents, maps, and so on, not based on a few people's memory or a few hundred people's memory. So you have talked to a few hundred people, but a counter view is that memory is notoriously unreliable. Memory, as neuroscientists and psychologists tell us, that memory is not a photograph. Memory evolves, and 75 years on, people's memory of what happened is not what happened. This is their memory of it. Sometimes it's not even their memory of it. It's an inherited memory from another generation. So what psychologists often say is, first time you remember something, soon after an incident happens, you remember the thing. Then thereafter, you remember your memory of that thing. And then you remember the memory of the memory of your thing. And a few decades later, it's very difficult to say what is real memory and what has kind of grown as folklore in people's minds and without any basis in reality. So it's a reconstruction rather than an accurate photograph of what happened or an accurate video of what happened. So can you tell us what is oral history and why should real historians accept oral history as serious history?
Sure. I say this knowing of my status as a second-class citizen in the in the hierarchy of historians, but that's okay. Oral history is the collection of oral testimony through video or audio means of a certain group or several groups of people pertaining to a particular historical event done through primarily an oral history questionnaire, which is both specific to an experience and can also be vague enough to encompass the entire event. Now, the advantages and challenges of working with autobiographical material, especially through a medium of oral history, have been well documented. And it is something that every historian does, traditional historian, does kind of scoff on. And I will agree, oral history comes with its own drawbacks, but all methodologies do. And the one thing I find interesting is that we simply assume that because in archival research or the traditional method of writing history, we are referring to a document and thereby some form of truth, right? But it is truth, but it is one form, one version, someone's version told through a particular perspective. It is not the truth of that historical event. Quite often it is the truth of the victor, right? And in my case, when I refer to documents at the British Library, it is often the colonists' view, right? Similarly, yes, oral history does in this way give you one perspective. One interview will provide one perspective. But the strength of this methodology is that it allows for a collective or multiple viewpoints or perspectives. The strength of oral history is in the diversity of voices that are allowed to coexist. And in some cases, where official archive has rendered a particular community invisible, or their story is simply not, it's completely obfuscated from official archive, oral history allows it place, it allows it its own voice. It allows people to speak for themselves with dignity and respect. And I think that's one of the absolute strengths of the medium. Critics of oral history will argue that using memory as a source of data is not reliable. I agree, but there are ways to corroborate memory as well. For instance, does your interviewee say the same things each time you interview them about a particular event? Even interviews should be subject to careful scrutiny. Does a particular community echo similar details about a particular event? For instance, does a community of people who migrated from one place on one particular day due to a particular riot or a particular massacre echo in the details the similarity of what happened to them? In this way, you are able to, through continuous comparison of different narratives, you can corroborate someone's memory as well. I would say that oral history tells us more about the experience of an event rather than the event itself. By this, I mean, if I study partition, then my interviewees may tell me less about the process of partitioning a subcontinent and more about the experience of having to live through partition or the meaning of partition for them. And I think in the kind of, I suppose for us as a subcontinent, we have not valued these stories, these small H histories of people enough, because they don't find place in official archive. And when an entire generation sacrifices and I just suppose the incredible horrors witnessed do not find place in official archive, then more creative means do need to be taken to make sure that stories are recorded for posterity.
Yeah, that I was kind of deliberately being a devil's advocate, but
I know.
but that certainly is gives it's like the flesh around the bones. The hard history or the classical history or the history of facts and dates and kings and rulers and maps and lines is hard history, but it is very black and white. It doesn't give you a human kind of flesh around the bones kind of thing. While collective memory or storytelling, because we sometimes believe that past is one immutable fact, and
Yes.
there's one way to tell the past because it happened. This is what happened. But as you say, who is to say what happened? From whose perspective are you saying what happened? So the histories we used to learn in school, and to a great extent children still learn in school, is a very one-sided nationalistic view of history. And as they grow and as they go to higher education, they probably widen their perspective. But in schools, we are taught in India, the history of the partition taught in India is completely different from history of partition taught in Pakistan. They
Yes.
are you wouldn't know that they are talking about the same event. It's so different because these are nationalistic history, almost sometimes jingoistic histories about telling the story from our perspective. But when you talk to people across lines on all sides of the current border, you then get to have a more kind of humanistic view rather than a jingoistic view on what happened. So is it right to say, have I understood correctly, that history is storytelling? And as long as you're telling many people's stories and corroborating those stories against one another, you get a reasonably good perspective of what happened. We'll never know. We'll never know for truth what happened, because there are always sides of the story. I don't know whether people of this age group remember, but in old days, I was a fan of this Japanese movie called Rashomon by a Japanese director, by Akira Kurosawa, who tells the story of a murder from several different perspectives. A guy got killed, and we would say, and the murderer was known. So this person killed this person. So on the face of it, there's one story, end of story. But there were so many stories, and he keeps looking at different versions of the story. And so I would suggest to some of the younger audience members to go find that movie, Rashomon. It's Akira Kurosawa was a very acclaimed Japanese film director. So the point is that there's no one truth, and everyone has their own truth.
Right. It's actually quite, in my opinion, quite dangerous to tell one monolithic history. And sometimes people do this, that, oh, this is what the Punjabi experience was like, or this is what the Bengali experience was like, this is what people from Hyderabad experience. And while there may be certain perspectives that do bind ethnicities together in terms of the storytelling, there is quite a danger in telling one single partition story. But I also want to say that oral historians cannot survive without archive. We cannot survive without archive. We need archive. It's just our secondary source. For instance, many times in my interviews, people do make mention of politics, but their details are vague. They are common people. They are people really on the ground. They are farmers. They are business people. They are very much on the ground. They don't quite understand what happens in the annals of history, but they know vague details. Heard on the radio, read in the paper, this date, this happened. This is the massacre that I lived through. I really need the archive to be able to know exactly what they are talking about. And sometimes I'm able to find the source, and other times I'm not. And then there may be discrepancy. And this is really where your, I suppose, expertise as an oral historian comes into play, the discrepancy between the details of what people remember and what actually happened or what is written in the source. And how do you make sense or navigate through both?
Yeah, exactly. And we know that from our day-to-day life, how our personal experience and what's written about it in official media doesn't line up very often. There's that saying, which we were talking about earlier, that the death of one man is a tragedy, a death of a million is a statistic. So what documented formal history of maps and lines is like talking about death of a million. You don't visualize it. But when you see one person dying in front of you, you visualize, and that creates a much deeper understanding of what happened rather than just read in the newspapers that 1 million people were killed. Like people like myself, I'm a kind of a second generation partition survivor. You are a third generation partition survivors. We've all heard these stories of how our grandparents and parents walked across the border and starved and went into refugee camps, and they could see people dying in front of you, and the very well documented stories of whole train loads of corpses arriving at the station and so on. That brought, I learned far more about partition from these stories from 5 or 6 people, my 2 sets of grandparents and maybe a few uncles, than studying history for 12 years in my school. You think that is valid history, or I could be accused of saying that, well, these are 6 people. How do you believe these 6 people?
Why is it not valid history? I think what I'm asking is, why do we trust the archives so much? Or why do we trust the statistics so much? Whereas here are the details that actually make up the statistic. And this is why I say I can't exist without the archive as well, because I know that they live in they live in cohabitation in my text. I think, yes, you're right. The one thing that speaking to people does is it makes you envision the details in a way that any text that I have read in my school has not been able to do, because it focuses on the humanity, the good and the bad. I think the details that people remember, I have to say that partition survivors are not vague in their details. If you think that, yes, time has passed, 75 years have passed, and some details may have faded, but the skeleton of what they've witnessed is really quite intact. And even if you speak to a 90-year-old, the details are not vague. They are specific. They are memorable to them, because these events of trauma sort of find their way into the long-term memory of that time. They may not remember what they ate for breakfast, but they certainly remember the name of the doodhwala when they were a child, the name of the maid, or what they were wearing when they left, what they carried, how it felt, the first person they saw as a dead body. Like, these are the things that, and I think this is what really haunted me. Like, when I started this work, I didn't expect there to be so many details, because so much time had passed. And you say, okay, well, they may remember stuff, they may not, but the specificity of memory is something that's incredibly striking with people. And I think these are the interviews that make up the ethnographic landscape of that time. I can't imagine what 1 million people is like. But I know that I get goosebumps when someone describes holding someone's head in their lap as they are dying. And I think that is really what teaches you humanity. And when you do cross-border stories, you also try, inevitably your own biases that you may not know you have are broken down, and you are forced to unlearn what you may have learned, what you may have inevitably learned through possibly jingoistic histories in school,
Yeah. And that happens in every traumatic event, not just in India. Right. A few years ago, 2015 or so, when the civil war in Syria was at its peak, and millions of Syrians had become refugees and were landing up on the borders of Europe. Most of Europe was not very receptive nor very sympathetic to the plight, until, I don't know if you recall, that picture of a 5-year-old boy that washed up on the beaches of Greece or Turkey, or somewhere in the Greece-Turkey border area. And that picture just galvanized the whole world. Angela Merkel opened Germany's borders to let refugees in. And that was one picture that completely changed the world's attitude towards the plight of Syrian refugees. So you've heard such stories from partition where you could kind of visualize and it all came together in a flash.
Of course, I think, and it's also the variety or the diversity of stories that are offered to you. They are not only stories of violence. They are incredible stories of kindness. stories of courage, stories of survival. I think that the fact that generations before us, our ancestors survived something like this, and they went on, they continued with their lives. But also the fact that, because I was asking, they described in great detail the difficulties of their circumstances, or how many rotis each child was allowed to eat in the camp, or how this is this image I can never forget of this young man who's telling me about his father, who was born just on the days of partition as his family was migrating to India. And he says that it was raining because it was one of the worst rainfalls in, I think, 100 years or something at that time. And it was raining and they were coming to Amritsar. And he says that my father was like a few days old. And every now and then in the train, when my father would cry, his grandfather would take off his turban and take it out to the window so that it was soaked in water, and then squeeze the water into the child's mouth. Now, you can imagine this. It's incredibly visual. It's incredibly moving. I think that kind of pathos, if people can recall it, helps us to imagine that time.
Yeah. I mean, I have heard a lot of that in my day, and like my nanny, my grandmother, my mother's mother, and their family walked for a few days from their town in Pakistan side of Punjab to the Indian side of Punjab, and there was no food. And she told me stories which, like, even now, maybe 30 years after she told me, I can still vividly remember. He said how there was no water, so they used to drink gatar ka pani, like water from the drain. She used to put her chunni, her dupatta, on the water to filter the water, and then drink that filtered water. And they had one pital ka glass, and they used to filter them, keep it in the glass and drink. And she did that one night, filtered with her dupatta, and kept the water and drank through the night. And it was dark, pitch dark in the in the fields where they were. And in the morning, she looked at the water and it was red.
Yeah. There are some things, I think, if you spend enough time with this material, you already assume are coming.
Yes.
You know? But the one thing I want to say is that younger people who have never witnessed something like this, and hopefully may never in their life, these are the stories that help them to imagine what people sacrifice to be a part of one country or another. And I think it goes beyond, because young people are born with the knowledge that the two nations are enemies, that we have fought 4 wars since independence, that we are antonyms of one another. But the minute you start to hear these stories, they feel more like mirrors than antonyms, that there is similar suffering that people experienced on both sides. And I think it helps them to unmake the other to a certain extent, at least.
Yeah. And that's what's the beauty of human stories in your oral histories. We start seeing people as real people rather than cut out cardboard characters that are painted.
Yeah.
These are not caricatures, these are real people. So as caricatures, a lot of Indians grow up saying Pakistanis are bad people. Pakistanis grow up saying Indians are bad people. But when they meet person to person, there's no bad people. I used to work in the Middle East, and most of my colleagues and friends were either Bangladeshis or Pakistanis. And I didn't find any bad people there. So, I mean, I'm still, again, just generalizing based on some 10, 20 people I knew. But so when it comes to that level, one-to-one level, all this animosity and stereotypes and good and bad just melt away. So
we find it very difficult to justify when we meet someone who is not in the manner that we imagine them to be, and is actually quite similar to us, more similar.
Yeah. I remember somewhere in one of your books, I kind of mix up the two books now. Maybe you could tell us, you were sitting with some women in your interviews in Pakistan, and they were talking about how Hindus and Sikhs were bad people at the time of partition, and then they realized that you were sitting with them and you are one of those bad people, and then they suddenly their tone changed. You tell us about that?
It happened many times in Pakistan. The strange thing is you have to realize you are the other in Pakistan. And with that comes great humility, but also great consciousness. Because you may be privy to details about, your ethnicity or your religion that you wouldn't hear of as ferociously otherwise. And it happened on numerous occasions where people were discussing what they survived and what was done to them in India before they left for Pakistan or during their journey. And then they would turn to me and say, well, I think the first time it happened, I wanted to confirm whether the family I was interviewing knew I was Hindu or not. And so I remember saying, "Aap jante hain na ki main Hindu hu?" And they said, "Nahi, tum to beti ho. You are like a daughter. You're not Hindu." So it's also very interesting why that happens, because we know a person, we think they are okay, whereas this other unnamed group that they belong to are still the other for us. Then in another circumstance in Pakistan, I remember I was getting a manicure, and this young woman who I think was probably the same age as I was is doing my manicure, and she says, "Ki Bibi, tusi kahan se ho? Where are you from? Islamabad se ho? Karachi se ho?" And I said, "Nahi, main Delhi se hu. I'm from Delhi." And she dropped my hand and she looked at me as if, I didn't know what to expect. And I said, okay, now she's going to ask me about, Kashmir, or she's going to ask me about, partition, and I need to be prepared. And she dropped my hand. Her voice became a whisper. She looked around the room and she said, "Tusi Bharat se ho? Why do you wear the same clothes as us? Why do you eat the same food as us? Can you tell me how much potatoes cost over there? How many times in a week do you eat meat?" Those were the questions she wanted to know. कि वहां पे inflation है कि नहीं है, because यहाँ पे ना onions बड़े expensive हैं. वहां पे भी expensive है कि नहीं? And I think she was so surprised because I looked like her, I was dressing like her, I spoke like her. She was just not prepared to meet someone so similar to her. And it really caught her off guard. And these kinds of things continue to happen because I think the view of who the other is on the other side of the border is so limited on both sides.
Yeah, that happens all the time. How people hold views about the mass, and then when it comes to a micro level, those views completely turn around. So just for us to understand, we've been talking about memory and inherited memory and so on, and collective memory. Somewhere again in your books, you've used phrases like official memory, political memory, collective memory, and then generational memory, I think. So are these different? What are these four kinds of memories that you talk about?
I think I experienced many kinds of memories. Of course, there are political memories that people associate with, very often in interviews with common people, they will start by saying, "Oh, we were not Nehru, or we are not Gandhi. What do you want to ask us about?" And they will say, "I remember when I was a boy, I listened to a radio broadcast about, the Round Table Conference in the 1930s, or I saw Pandit Nehru come to Lahore to announce Poon Swaraj, So they will start with these kinds of memories that they think are interesting because they link to the official politics of that time. Then there are also family memories that people, very nostalgia, stories of childhood, that people, I think I prefer to begin with childhood for a lot of people because it takes them to a time that is unmarked by borders and unmarked by violence. And often it is long-term memory, so it is clearer and there are more details. And then the kind of memory the two kinds of memory that I really spent a lot of time on in my writing career were material memory, focusing on material artifacts that have been carried across by people on either side of the border as catalysts for remembrance, and generational memory that is passed down the generations and finds a way to survive, even though the original bearer of that memory may not be around. And it does so in various ways. It can morph and transform.
So just going back to that gory story I told you about the red glass of red water. That's not my memory. I've heard it, and as you were saying before I finished that story, you knew what was coming because you've heard it from many people. I've heard it from many people. I have kept it in my somewhere in my brain that it came from my nani. I don't even know if it came from her or I've kind of attributed it to her because I hear it from my extended family all over the place, and I have read it in some, I think, Khushwant Singh's novels and things like that. So did I make it up? Did my nani actually say that? So does it matter? Does that invalidate it, or is it still valid memory?
No, I think this is just the nature of memory. At any event of great trauma, it is perfectly natural for collective memory to become personal memory. For instance, you may not have seen a person being murdered, but if you're living in the camp and everyone around you is talking about what they've seen, you may embed that into yourself and say, yes, of course, even I have seen bodies. Even I have seen blood being washed from trains. I've seen it. But does this make the experience of living through it untrue, or does it invalidate that testimony? No, I don't think so. I think at some point, if someone is trusting you and they are descending into themselves to take out, really exhume what is the most deepest and volatile part of their life for most, you have to have enough respect to give it, dignity on your page. And this is how they want that history to be remembered for them. I think this was very important for me, that you are no one to judge, and you are no one to sort of recreate the kind of history they are saying. They are using specific memories, specific words, and you have to do that rendition justice, regardless of whether you may agree with it or not. And this is really the case when you're working across borders. Things may not agree with your personal belief, but here, in your capacity as an oral historian of a particular historical event, you need to render that experience in the manner that people are telling you about it.
Yeah, and so moving on, as we are kind of running towards our dead time limit. So there was kind of a secret contract of silence for decades for some reason. Many of my family, and I'm sure many of your interviewees in your research, because it was so traumatic, they kind of put it in some part of their brain and tried to shut it out. And for many decades after partition, not many people talked about it, certainly didn't talk about it outside their small family circles. And there was certainly not much written about it until people like you and a few other projects, like the Dastan project and all of those people have started kind of digging into the memories, the first-hand oral memories of partition. And firstly, it is just in time, because the people who own those first-hand memories are passing. In the next 10 years, we won't have anyone left who has a first-hand memory, because it's 75 years. So already people who have a first-hand memory are by definition above 80 years old. So was it a good thing that this is now being talked about 60, 70, 80 years later? Because in early decades, the memories were probably too raw and too accusatory, like too much of bad blood and bad feelings and accusations. And now maybe after 70 years, people have kind of reconciled and they have a more detached and less emotional and less confrontational memory of what happened. Is that a good way of looking at it, or should we have captured these memories 30 years ago?
I think you still may have that accusatory tone. It really depends on, well, you may have memories of violence, you may have memories of otherness, and people may still want to blame other communities. I don't think that has changed. And even subsequent generations are very willing to blame other communities for what happened or who the other is. But this question of silence is one I've thought of a lot. Why did people not speak about what they had witnessed? And you see, when we think about partition in comparison to the Holocaust, there is a lot more work done on Holocaust, but it also did not happen immediately. It also took time, a generation, in fact. And I think this is it, right? That in the immediate aftermath of partition, what were people to say? How would they talk about something they couldn't quite understand themselves? For so many people, it happened so rapidly, losing everything, becoming homeless, new life, new town, new language and culture sometimes. If I speak to my own grandparents' experience living in a refugee camp immediately after partition, they did not want their everyday conversation to be about what had been lost. They wanted it to be about, look, I gained, I earned 5 rupees today. What can we eat with that? Or I got a job, or I am saving to buy a shop. It was very much looking towards the future because they did not have the luxury to, I suppose, live in the past, because everyone around them was experiencing the same thing. So perhaps that's one reason for silence. Another reason for silence, and I discuss this quite at length in my second book, is that we don't actually have a vocabulary to talk about trauma. We are not given the freedom, the openness, the words, even the nonverbal vocabulary to discuss something as traumatic as the birth of a nation, and so we find ourselves ill-equipped to not only offer that experience to our subsequent generations, but also subsequent generations to ask the question. When I was starting out, I didn't know what I needed to ask. I didn't know how I could ask, the tone, the manner, what question was invasive, what question would shut someone down. I think you learn that on the job, but I do believe sometimes you need an external person to ask the question in order to receive some sliver of memory. And even then, I think someone may not want to talk about it, and that is their prerogative. But I suppose there's no one reason for silence. All I can say is that people who talk about partition now, it's very courageous to return to that time, because really they have no obligation to talk about it. And if they choose silence, then we must respect that silence.
To that point, there could be kind of an uncharitable view taken or towards this oral history projects like this is maybe they had a good reason. The people who saw all those horrors 75 years ago, maybe they had a good reason to stay quiet. Maybe they had a good reason to shut that memory out of their conscious brain. And shouldn't, to be very blunt about it, shouldn't we let them just pass and die in peace? Why at this late stage of their life are we reopening old wounds and scratching their old wounds and making them relive those horrors? What is to be gained? Of course, if there's something to be gained, maybe it's a good trade-off. But shouldn't that generation be left to pass without us bothering them and making them relive the horror?
That's one way to put it. Definitely, it's something that I have contemplated a lot. But there's this book, Kamleshwar's book, Kitne Pakistan, and in that he writes, history which can provide remedial insight into the past is often cast aside. Which means that if we don't learn from the past, we are doomed to make mistakes, the same mistakes. In that sense, I suppose we are recording first-hand testimony to make sure that such experiences are not experienced by people again, or to learn from what people experienced. But I want to say that even if someone has agreed to speak to you, which is, the first thing, to allow me to come to your house to record you about this particular topic. Even if someone has agreed to speak to you, they have no obligation to speak to you. there have been, sorry, there have been instances where someone knows I'm coming to talk about this particular event of their lives, and I arrive and the family meets me with a lot of chai, pani and everything. And then we go to the room where I'm supposed to speak to the person, and he doesn't want to talk. He doesn't want to say anything because maybe he's changed his mind. Or maybe at the time there are too many people in the room. Or maybe everyone else is talking over him and he finds it overwhelming because everyone is saying, ye bhi batao, wo bhi batao. Yaad hai aapne mujhe ye bataya tha. Acha, tell her about, sometimes I suppose you want to remember at your pace. And even if you've agreed to remember for somebody, you may not want to at that time. And there have been several moments when I've left because I don't think it's right for me to say, nahi, par aapne to kaha tha ki aap batayenge. Because I do think forgetting is a very important part of the remembering process, and is as equal in importance as remembering, perhaps. And it is people's prerogative when they choose to say what they choose to say. Like when I started interviewing my grandmother, the first thing she said was, okay, well, ask me quickly before I forget. And then recently, and this is about 8 or 9 years ago, and then recently she said, when you ask, I go back into that time, and sometimes I wish I didn't have to remember. Now, these are objectively contradictory statements, but in human memory, things are complicated and they are contradictory because these are humans and humans are messy, and remembrance is not chronological, and remembrance can adhere to your mood, and it can be prompted by things in the present, during so many times people said, and this is really when oral histories of partition came out, during the 84 massacre, a lot of people recalled partition because it felt like partition. And this is really when the first oral history of partition by Ritu Menon, Urvashi Butalia, Kamla Bhasin, they started working because they were working in the camps, and they started listening to stories that felt like palimpsests of other stories that had already happened. So sometimes present day events can reignite and bring stories to light. But, like the final statement I will say is, you can't make someone talk about something that they don't want to at that time, even if they've agreed to speak about it.
Mm-hmm. True. Okay, well, a couple of last things before we open up to the audience. One is, it has always intrigued me that somehow in popular media, as well as in history books and in literature and so on, the Punjab partition has got like the lion's share of attention. But as you write in your book, there were many partitions. Punjab was one partition. There was Gujarat partition, Rajasthan partition, Bengal, Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura, and so on. So many partitions happened, but maybe because we Punjabis are loud people, we made more noise about it than other people. So you have tried to redress that balance. I see a lot of stories in your books which are not about Punjab partition; they are about many of these other partitions. But why is there this imbalance between the talk about Punjab in media, in fiction, in like history books? Why is Punjab so much focus on Punjab?
And I will actually add to that statement a little bit, not just focus on Punjab, but focus on the violence of Punjab. Because all these stories inevitably focus around the trauma and the violence and the tragedy and the trains and the people walking and the murders and arson and rape and looting. But it's a great question and it bears scrutiny. I think there is being work done on the Bengal partition. It's not that there isn't. It may just be in academia, that's one, and may not find its way to popular history so much, which is obviously more readable by common people. But the other reason for it is because partition, when it happened in the Punjab, it was very violent. And it was a lot of violence in a very short span of time, after which the border got cemented. It was very, very clear to cross the Western border, you are going to need X amount of paperwork, or, it was, there was not visas, but there was before the visa, you had Anyway, the border was very fortified very quickly because of the amount of incredible violence that happened. Comparatively, on the eastern side, the violence was drawn out. It's not that it wasn't there, it was drawn out and peppered through the decade. And the border was a lot more porous. There was a lot more travel back and forth, not just for trade, but also families. They continued to keep estates on both sides. They continued to keep family relations on both sides. And I think in that sense, perhaps, I don't want to say less has come out of Bengal, because again, there may be a lot in the vernacular that English readers cannot read, but I know that a lot of work is being done now. And I think, yes, it is a bit unfair that it is very unfair that Punjab gets so much attention. But as you rightly said, there were many, not just partitions, but many ramifications of partition in so many geographic areas. Gujarat, for instance, Sidhpur, it's not just people who migrated, it's people who remained as well, remained in fear or chose not to migrate, or people who migrated not in the helm of the violence, but at other points in time, people from Rajasthan, people from parts of Sindh that came into the Thar desert and made new colonies. Government gave them new settlement colonies in the middle of the desert. Hyderabad saw a different kind of migration. There were migrations from Kochi in Kerala all the way to Dera Ismail Khan. Obviously, the Mohajir migration from UP and parts of Delhi to Sindh province. And then the Punjab migration, of course. But I think there are many factors at play as to why Punjab has dominated. And I want other aspects, I want other scholars to rightly take their place, because we do need to hear about more stories. Because the time is now if you want to record first-hand experiences of it.
Great. Okay, on that one, just a quick anecdote on that. Sam Dalrymple has been researching many partitions, and he was in Ahmedabad a couple of days ago, and we brought him into our campus, and we had a long chat with him. And just an aside, he mentioned that you are his guide and mentor, and he looks up to you in a big way, and so on. But he's also doing a lot of work on other partitions beyond Punjab and Bengal. He's working on the Burma, where like a large part of Nagas from Nagaland are stuck in the wrong side of the border, and the Rohingyas in Burma who found themselves on the other side of the border, and so on. So he brought in a lot of perspectives. So people like you and Sam Dalrymple and many of you are kind of giving a big whole picture of several partitions, not one partition. Okay, finally, you have brought yourself into your books. So your books are not written like many history books are written, where the author is invisible. You are very visible. The whole project started with your own grandparents and you interviewing them. So you are an oral historian, an anthropologist, and a granddaughter of partition survivors. So just for people in our audience who are into researching and writing, how does that work? Your detached anthropology hat, your oral historian hat, and your granddaughter hat. How do you juggle these various hats to get a perspective?
My first book looked at survivors of partition, and my second book looked at descendants. And I think in the first book, I was very careful to not insert myself too much, apart from facilitating conversation. I don't have many opinions in the first book. I don't offer much insight apart from as a narrator of what is happening. And I thought that people who had never gotten a chance to speak must find their voice on these pages. So I did not interrupt so much. I only spoke when I absolutely had to. So that's the first book, Remnants. The second book, in the language of remembering, I think it was impossible for me to do that because the entire book is based on descendant interviews, people in their second, third, fourth generation of partition families, people like myself. And I think that I tried to be a very austere scholar, but it would have never worked because so many of the things people were saying were things that I was asking, and things that they were feeling were things that I had felt. Or maybe what they were saying is completely opposite to what I thought, and I wanted to voice my opinion. And at the end, I think the book became a lot more autobiographical than I would have imagined or preferred, which it's always quite terrifying to put yourself on the page. But I think it was very important because I was as much an interviewee as anyone else. You know, I always offered my interviews, please ask me questions as well, and some did and some did not, because this is a strange process for them to begin with. But I think you have to be, you know, this is something I learned with my interviews that may not have found its way into Remnants, that if you want someone to open up to you about something so vulnerable and drastic in their lives, then you have to be open to answering questions about your own life. And while I did this in conversation with partition survivors, it may not have found itself on the page, but in the second book, it definitely did. Because I feel like the story was ours together. You know, we were all inheritors in some way, and equally disjointed in the manner in which we felt things about partition, and there was a lot of resonance.
So just to close on that, so many people in this audience, because we are an academic institution, many of us here are academics, and we are taught by training to be objective, to not be subjective, and to be dispassionate, look at the scene, be a fly on the wall, do not get involved in the emotions of the situation. And that's not just about history, but about whether you are an anthropologist, an ethnographer, a sociologist, a psychologist. Look at things dispassionately as a researcher, not as a participant. But you obviously kept going back and forth across that line.
Right. I think in the first book, I tried very hard to be just researcher. But in the second book, I think I was always going to be participant. And I think that I don't come from historical training. So these are things I may pick up along the way in my fieldwork, but my training is as an artist. I'm a visual artist trained as a printmaker. We are very much involved with whatever process we do. It's a very bodily, very emotional function. And I don't think I can let that go. Now, I know I may bring a lot of criticism with my methodology, but what works for one person may not work for another person. And I absolutely accept that.
Yeah. And your training as an artist shows through in your writing. Your writing is very visual. As I was telling you before we started the webinar, I've been traveling around and carrying your 600-page book. All you tell me it's 1 kilo. It felt like 3 kilos to me. I've been carrying that around in reading in airport lounges and on flights and in my commuting to work and so on. And it's almost addictive. That book is so addictive because you can see it's almost like watching a movie. It's very visual. So that's your artist training showing through. Okay, I think we have some really good questions coming up. So Sudhir, should we take questions now?
Yes, and we have a hard stop at 5:30 p.m. So I would request people to just keep the questions very short. So I would like to invite Jones Joseph, if you can come on camera and ask a question.
Yeah, hi. I'm sorry, I'm not able to be
No
on.
problem. Yeah.
If it's okay.
Yeah, it is okay. Please.
Yeah. So I had a question. It's mainly to do with, when we say truth, it's quite relative, and that's what eventually you did bring it out. So one, there is a fact, and that's irrefutable. That's something which we cannot dispute. But then, of course, truth, your truth is different slightly from my truth, and I'm not getting into post-truth. Not that's not the intent really. But what I meant is eventually who gets to decide what is the fact, and how do we treat that, and how do we ensure that there is a equal representation or a judicious mix if I may say, of the different truths? And how do we crystallize that?
I mean, as you said, fact is irrefutable, though. So nobody gets to just, I mean, the fact is like India and Pakistan got partitioned in August 47. That's fact.
Absolutely.
Proofs are various people's perspective of what they felt or saw around that time. Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yes, yes.
Right. I think I addressed that a little bit in the presentation, but I suppose it depends on the circumstance of what you're doing and who you're interviewing. But the one thing that I have learned is it may vary depending on who you're speaking to, right? But it does not invalidate either truth. In fact, sometimes you need to put them side by seeing how much they converge and how much they diverge. I'll give you an example. There's a chapter in this new book of mine where I have several interviews from the area of Mirpur, which is now in Pakistan. And there is a very traumatic interview of a Sikh family that migrated from Mirpur. And there is an equally traumatic interview of a Muslim family that adopted a Sikh daughter in Mirpur. And those interviews are kept side by side to each other because you need to see both sides of the picture. Does that make sense to you? I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm completely answering your question.
Well, partly, yes. What I meant really was who gets to decide on saying this is the fact and this is not a truth. If you know what I mean.
Well, it's certainly not going to be me because my job is to present the, I suppose, various truths of people I speak to. But I think maybe in official history, perhaps the historian gets to decide based on their brief.
Because we always, also looked at a cliched term. It's the victor who writes the history, right?
It's true.
And from that perspective, a lot of the times, truths, and particularly when it comes to the represented or underrepresented factions of society, that's where we often find there's a grave injustice. And you did talk about justice, so I again asked what is justice then? Who gets
I think I actually made quite a fair case for the fact that oral history, which is not the official archive, but is a valid form of recording historical sources, particularly oral testimony, accounts for people who have been absolutely erased by official archive. You're right. There is not enough space, or not every community finds place in official archive, which is a grave injustice to the experiences of those people. But oral history as a methodology allows for their stories to be told, often in their own voices.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so next I would like to invite Shefali Shah. She has a very interesting question, if you can.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. Aanchal, I have read your first book and found it very enlightening. And of course, meeting you today in this format has been a real honor and pleasure. Okay. My question is really about how much and how far one should remember. How long should national memory last? A national memory of horrors last? As Professor Ravi started out by saying, most young people today don't really know what partition is about. In fact, we'll see that all over the world, young people choose, for whatever reason, to move beyond the horrors of the past. The Holocaust, too, is something that most young people really don't know about, or certainly don't care about. If you're talking about Europe or the US, they feel this is the past, this has nothing to do with us. Our grandparents, and which young person doesn't feel their grandparents or parents were misguided? Okay, so they made all those mistakes, it has nothing to do with us. I know that the people who experienced it have something very, very important, very valuable to share with us. But should we really keep remembering all this? Or is there a case to be made for moving beyond? And in connection with that, I will say, should Independence Day also be celebrated or observed as Partition Horrors Day? Isn't there some kind of contradiction there? That's my question, or questions.
Yeah, I resonate with a lot of things you're saying. Is it easier to just not talk about the past? One would think so. One would think so. But, you know, as someone who has spent the last 9 years talking to young people of her age, I was absolutely not prepared for how many people bring up the past because they don't know enough about it. And I think this question of where am I from? Where is my native village? Why is my native village inaccessible to me? Why can't I walk on the soil of my ancestors with dignity? It does come to haunt those of us who have a personal relationship to partition. And so in that sense, I think it's important to talk about what has been lost and what has been left behind. But horror and violence is not the only thing that we need to talk about, which is really where my issue with Partition Horrors Remembrance Day lies. Partition, yes, it was an event of horror and violence, but that is one landscape of partition. It is not the entire landscape. It cannot be. An event of that cataclysmic scale has to encompass other emotions in it. It must. So where there is space for violence, there has to be space for kindness. There has to be space for sacrifice, friendship. In this new book that I have written, each of the chapters are divided by emotion. Because emotion is something that everyone feels, irrespective of your nationality, your religion, ethnicity, caste, whatever. And violence is not a chapter because that's a byproduct of every story. And I find it is a grave injustice to partition that we only discuss the trains or people walking or the horrors, where we don't discuss the friends that no longer saw each other, or the neighbors that could never fly kites, or people that fell in love because of partition. My grandparents fell in love in a refugee camp. Her sister and her husband got married in that camp. You know, people whose, and you know, fiancés that fell apart, or people that were reunited. These stories don't find place in our vocabulary. Why? I'm very tired of partition only focusing on the violence, whereas there is so much more. There is such a huge emotional landscape of partition that is waiting to be talked about. These are the stories that people, you know, children should say, you know, my grandfather sent all the library of their neighbor who had crossed over the border to Pakistan. He did that. That is friendship. You know, things like that. I don't know whether young people should not ask. I mean, I'm always conflicted because asking brings up a lot of sadness, but asking also makes us more aware of our past. So I don't know how much of your question I can answer with certainty, but we are on the same page about many things.
Thank you. If I could just add, you know, I'm on a WhatsApp group with my school classmates. Okay, so we're all of a certain generation. That group got broken into two because one section said our grandparents or our parents lived through all of these experiences. Okay, nobody else can understand where we're coming from. We don't want to be, and they refused to continue in a group where other perspectives were being raised. Okay? They said, no, we only belong in this very narrow way, and we do not wish to go beyond that. They exited the group. Okay, now that's so sad that a group of school friends, okay, gets broken up because one group believes in holding on to very, very strong, narrow ideas of identity. Okay,
yes, I'm sorry.
But that's what's happening everywhere. That's the sad part. So when you keep holding on to the past, is that the danger that we're running into? I'm not justifying, I'm not criticizing, I'm just asking.
I don't think that there's one answer to this, right? You can hold on to the past with the understanding that you're using it to prevent such a future from happening again. Or you can hold on to the past quite narrowly and say, you did this to my family. So there are both. And I think that we need to learn to coexist with both ways. I mean, I certainly get a lot of love for my work, but I also get a lot of criticism for it. And that's okay. Because I can't, I can't make everyone happy. I can only do what I'm trying to do, which is really bring younger people into the conversation, because they're history needs to be written also by younger historians for their generations, right?
Thank you. We look forward to more of your books.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Now I request Chandni to ask a question.
Thank you so much, sir. I thank the Ahmedabad University for giving us the opportunity to connect with Aanchal ma'am. I'm a huge admirer of your work, ma'am, and it's a delight to talk to you again. But my question was that in your experience, how does the rest of the world view 1947 petition today?
That's such a great question because we just went through the anniversary, right? And I came into personally, I saw how it views. From a lot of people that I'd spoken to for my second book from the diaspora, when they were young, they learned very interesting ways about how partition happened. They learned that Gandhiji was the one that spearheaded the country into independence. They learned that he was the one, basically all conversations centered around him. There was really not so much about the violence or the division of population, which it was a bit stunning for me to hear because so much of the country went through this. So I think in the West, perhaps partition is seen as quite a simplistic division of territory and population, whereas anytime people look at it, even at a glance, a little more closely, they will see how complicated it is. But I think now, having just been through the 75th anniversary and written op-ed pieces for newspapers around the world, I can say that people do want to read a more nuanced perspective of how the legacy of partition has continued on. Because it's not a static event, right? It's not something that happened 75 years ago and then it was kind of done. It is something that has ramifications both in politics, in geopolitics, in trade, in human relationships. And I think that is something that the rest of the world, apart from South Asia, is interested in now. How does partition persist? And it doesn't have to be in the very big terms, as in Kashmir or water or trade. It can also be in the small interpersonal relationships between people.
Thank you, ma'am. I had another question, and that is that how do we sustain the tradition of archiving oral history? Now, like Professor Miglani said, that the first generation is dwindling in number. How do we keep this practice alive in the subcontinent?
This is something I'm also battling with. How do we consider secondhand memory as archive enough? Should such an archive exist of secondhand memory? I mean, that's kind of the question I asked in my second book, that one of the reasons why it took so long to put it together was because I didn't think enough people would be interested in reading secondhand memory. But this archive needs to grow. I don't know at what capacity, and I don't know for what events. For partition, certainly. I don't know if I can speak to like other events, you know.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Now I would like to invite Satya Oza to ask the question. Satya, if you can. Satya.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah,
Hello.
yes.
Ma'am, my name is Satya, and I'm a PhD student in Ahmedabad University. I had like a question. Like, I just recently saw Miss Marvel, which kind of talked about the partition of India and Pakistan, and kind of led me to a couple of points that I was thinking about. Like, there's a very love-hate relationship between India and Pakistan. If you look at the online thing, like if there's a match, they're criticizing each other. But if there is like a Coke Studio Pakistan, there seems to be like love, like Indians are all going like, wow, Coke Studio Pakistan is so beautiful, it's so great. So I want to understand, like, do you think that there is that reconciliation between the people of these two countries is possible? If it is possible, then do oral histories come into, like, do oral histories have a part to play, and what part to play? Like, that was my broad question.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you think reconciliation is possible?
I could hope. I mean, I don't think so, but I do hope. I mean, because the more I see there, I mean, see Pakistan's culture, it seems like we are so similar in many ways. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it is possible, but I can surely hope that it's possible.
Many people feel like you. in India and Pakistan. I don't, truth and reconciliation, there is an order to these words. And before reconciliation comes truth, and before truth comes the acknowledgement of various truths. We've talked a lot about truth in this
Yes,
webinar.
ma'am.
I think it's very important for common people and governments of both countries to listen to each other's perspective, because you have to acknowledge that your truth is different, that
Yeah.
you experience different things originating from the same event. You have to accept it, and only then can you reconcile with the fact that there are these differences. And yet, despite that, there are these similarities that bind us together. It's quite ironic that the moment of partition is also the moment that binds us to one another, right?
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
We
yes.
are conjoined in our division in some ways. And I think that this is such a kind of tragically beautiful irony about it. I don't know if reconciliation is possible through the formal ways in which you may be thinking of reconciliation. But I think that if no formal way is devised by the governments of either country, we do need to rely on people that, like artists and academics and musicians and playwrights and oral historians, that defy border in their work.
Yeah.
And, rely on borderless means to do their work. And in that sense, you may see a kind of cultural reconciliation happen, because when you meet someone from there, you can talk to them. There is
Exactly.
right? So
Yeah.
maybe it will have to be a person-to-person reconciliation.
Yeah. That's why I use the word people and not countries, because politically I don't think, but people in that sense, yeah, I do think that there is a chance.
I agree.
Yeah, so there are a lot of interesting questions, but this will be the last one, and I would request you for 2 more minutes, if that is possible. Can we go ahead with this last question, Aanchal, if you?
Last question from my end?
No, from the audience. I have a long list, but
Yes, I do absolutely have to go at 5:30.
okay.
But if it's a short question, then yes.
Yeah, it is. So I would like to invite Professor Tana Trivedi to ask a question quickly, and then after that, I would request Professor Ravi Miglani to close this.
Yeah, so just Aanchal, thank you so much for this wonderful, absolutely wonderful talk. And it is very close to my heart because, again, I'm not a trained historian, I'm more of a literature person, but I do work on vernacular archives. And my question really is to do with archives. And how important do you think that classrooms really need archives? In the sense, as somebody who has been teaching for so many years, one thing that I realize is that history is taught not as storytelling, but rather as a set of facts, like you said. And therefore, actually bringing the archives to the class, or the accessibility of archives is very important. Where a lot of younger generation can kind of be made to be interested in history. So just very quickly, your views about the possibility of including archives as really a subject in the classroom.
I think that's a fantastic idea if you have access to those archives, because a lot of people don't. But anytime that an archive or a set of documents has been introduced into a classroom, it always invigorates the conversation, because it is very exciting for young students to see and touch documents of history. And I think it also kind of, it removes the abstraction from history. When we study through textbooks, there is an abstract sense of something happening. But when you touch, I know this happens to me when I touch an archive, when I'm sitting with it, I'm spending time with it, I can't believe I'm holding part of that history. So I think that classrooms would hugely benefit from engaging with official archive.
Yeah, and again, the last thing along similar lines, including even oral histories in the classroom, maybe inviting people to come and talk about their experiences, I think would also be a very interesting exercise for the younger generation. Yep.
Okay. I love doing that.
I have to let you go now.
Yes, I'm very sorry.
Okay, so in a few seconds, we'll let you go. So Aanchal, after such an engrossing conversation, and we've got such a good perspective. I don't think I'll spoil the moment by a long closing statement. So no closing statements are needed. This was all very engrossing. Just one last comment is that in the day and age that we are living in, where the world and our country is getting so polarized, this kind of is an antidote to polarization, because polarization comes from official nationalist jingoistic histories, and your kind of history breaks those boundaries, and hopefully young people can see many sides of the story and not the nationalistic jingoistic political side of the story. So that's perfect timing. Hope more and more young people. And to Tana's point, bringing oral historians in the classroom is a great idea. So we'll be reaching out to you. Hopefully you can come into our classrooms and talk to our students about it.
I would love that. I would love that. Thank you so much. Sometimes nuanced conversations really get ideas going in, obviously, always in my mind also. And I really appreciate the very thoughtful questions and, of course, the audience questions as well. Thank you for engaging with my work.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And there were a lot of questions that because of time people could not ask. So you can write to Aanchal directly, and if
Absolutely.
you are interested, yeah, that will be really helpful. So thanks a lot for joining us on Saturday afternoon. Take care and see you soon on 29th October.